Oh, crap. Maybe I shouldn't sit like this. Hang on a second. Ugh. That was some serious double chin. All right, I wanted to share with you something very special in my heart, and that being Pinky. Here's Pinky.
And now, the parts of the brain, performed by the brain.
Yes.
Yay, Pinky!
Neocortex frontal lobe.
Brainstem!
Hippocampus neural node, right hemisphere. Pons and cortex visual.
Brainstem!
Sylvian Fisher pineal, left hemisphere. Cerebellum left, cerebellum right. Synapse hypothalamus, striatum dendrite. Axon fibers matter gray.
Brainstem!
Central tegmental pathway, temporal lobe. White core matter for brain skull.
Brainstem!
Central fissure cord spinal, parietal. Diameter, meningeal medulla oblongata and lobe limbic. Microelectrodes. The brain. That ought to keep the little squirts happy. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I got a little carried away. That was Pinky for you. Pinky is a class act, let me tell you. But before we can get to the brain, we have to clean up a little bit of nervous system stuff here. Just simplified nervous system. So we have a reflex arc. A reflex arc is when your brain does not have control over the response, depending. There are some where you do. Those are called polysynaptic reflexes. And those, when your brain doesn't have any control, those are called monosynaptic reflexes. And all of them incorporate a reflex arc. So some stimulus occurs, sensory neuron carries it into the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, it may integrate or synapse with a interneuron, although it doesn't have to, which will, then synapse with a motor neuron and have an effect. Okay. So here's a simple reflex arc on the left. You see the hammer that the doctor will hit your patella tendon with, and that causes sensory receptors, stress receptors in your quadriceps they sense the flexion, the torsion, and they synapse directly in the spinal cord with the motor neuron that links up with those effectors, and it causes your leg to kick. Excuse me. You then have this here, for example, still a monosynaptic reflex, although it's weird because it has multiple synapses, but it's still a monosynaptic reflex because it doesn't incorporate the brain. And in this case, you have touching a pin, you say ow, and you draw back your finger, of course. Okay. So reflexes are not always, ow, I touched the pin, I need to move out of the way. There's also autonomic reflexes that you aren't aware of that are occurring, such as smooth muscle regulation, when to contract them, when to not. Heart and blood pressure regulation, dilating and contracting your blood vessels to manipulate blood pressure in response to conditions that where you need more blood and how fast and so on. When to release hormones from your glands, and then digestive system, of course, when to digest, when to not, and so on. The ones we just previously talked about with your knee and touching of the pin and so on, those are somatic reflexes. To give you an idea of a polysynaptic reflex, which is not shown here, polysynaptic reflex would be, for example, if I am holding a baby and all of a sudden the baby drops, I'm now aware of the circumstance and I have a choice as to whether I want to catch the baby or let the baby fall. That's kind of the polysynaptic reflex where the brain is involved in that. So again, the central nervous system is brain and spinal cord, but it didn't always look like that. During embryonic development, the brain is actually in the form of a tube. That's called a neural tube, and that tube will then become the brain and spinal cord down the middle of the baby, the middle of the embryo. And then the opening in the middle is going to become the ventricles, and we'll talk about the ventricles in a bit. But these are chambers within the brain that are filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and they serve a number of purposes, mainly for the circulation of CSF, or cerebral spinal fluid, for shock absorption. So let's get into the regions of the brain, of course, here, as you saw Pinky so well describe. You have the cerebral hemispheres on the outside. That's part of the cerebrum. Okay, that's your typical frontal, parietal, temporal, and so on that we'll go through. Then you have the diencephalon in the middle, and this is for tomorrow's lecture, as well as the brainstem and the cerebellum. Those things we will go through tomorrow. So the cerebral hemispheres to go through first. You have left and right sides. They each serve different functions, which many of you know. Excuse me. And it's actually half of the brain's mass is made up by the cerebrum, or more than half. So it's a big, thick area. This is the gray matter of the brain, of course. And here you have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe here in the top middle, the temporal lobes on the sides, and then the occipital lobe in the back for vision. The cerebellum is below the occipital lobe, and then you have the spinal cord will come out from down here. Now, the other thing to notice here is that there's all these wrinkly grooves and so on. And I remember doing a 6th grade research project on the brain. Funny how I remember that. But one of the things I very clearly remember was that it's not necessarily the size of the brain that matters. It's the number of wrinkles that you have. So size doesn't really matter. The more wrinkly your brain, the more intelligent you potentially are or have the ability to be, because those wrinkles increase the surface area. Now those wrinkles, those grooves, are called sulci, or singular is sulcus, okay? And the peaks, the little hills or ridges next to it, are called gyri, or gyrus for singular, okay? And you can see those shown here, okay? Now the cerebrum itself, you see, is divided by those grooves, by those fissures, those are the deep grooves, into different lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal, as we've already talked about. Now, what does each of those sections do? We'll get into that separately, not in this lecture, but we'll go through some various activities and so on to do that. But this is a very characteristic picture here of a man's brain, who some of you may know, who now I'm strangely blanking on his name. But he was I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. He was a railroad worker, and he was laying down tracks, and they set explosives to blow up rocks, and one of the bars from the railroad track blew up off the track, and it entered up through his cheek, underneath his cheekbone here, and went behind his eye and up through his frontal lobe. Now, before the accident, he was known as a very nice, cordial guy, and then after, he became just a prick, and everybody didn't like him, and he would cuss all the time and blurt out words, and he totally lost his ability to control and regulate his actions in that way. And here you see kind of how the pole went through. He did live, of course, obviously, based on the fact that we know his actions after, with the pole sticking out of his head. Whether it was really because there was a pole sticking out of his head that just made him pissed off, why do I have a pole in my head, or because his brain was altered, we don't know for sure. I'd be pretty pissed if I had a pole sticking out of my head through my cheek. All right, here's the lobes. This is the anatomy of the brain. Some of the items in here you do not have to know, but going through the items that you do, for example, the third ventricle, the thalamus, you need to know, the frontal lobe, the hypothalamus here, this purple region that you need to know down here, the optic chiasm, or chiasma, you don't have to know until the next unit, until sensory. Here you see the pituitary gland attached to the hypothalamus. Then you have the temporal lobe, which is shown strangely on the other side, but you know where the temporal lobe is. The pons you need to know, we'll get into that tomorrow. Medulla tomorrow. And then here you have the cerebellum, that cauliflower-like looking structure. The choroid plexus, there's one here. You see another one up here. The choroid plexus we'll talk about in just a second. And then here we have ventricles, and there's a ventricle up here, although it's not really shown. What else? The cerebral peduncle, one of the better names. Here you see cerebral peduncle. The midbrain shown here. These two structures, corpora quadrigemina and cerebral aqueduct, these make up the midbrain. Here you have the, well, it must be late because I'm blanking. The corpus callosum that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. Here again you see the thalamus. You have the pineal body, which makes up part of the epithalamus. the occipital lobe, the choroid plexus again, corpus callosum that I mentioned, and then the parietal lobe. All those structures you want to be able to identify. Some specific specialized areas of the cerebrum. So again, the cerebrum is the outer region of the brain, the gray matter. So there's a somatic sensory area that receives the impulses from the outside world, so to speak, from the sensory neurons. And this is found in the parietal lobe. Then you have the primary motor area, which is the area that controls all of your actions in response to these. And this is at the posterior side of the frontal lobe. And then there's also an area called Broca's area, which is your ability to speak, frontal lobe. And this is one of the areas, for example, in awake brain surgery that they have to be very careful not to remove because that significantly impairs the quality of life or affects it because you can't speak. You can think and know what you want to say, but you physically can't form the words. And we'll show you a little bit what that looks like. This is a very characteristic picture showing you the motor area, the primary motor cortex, in the frontal lobe, and here in the parietal lobe you have the sensory cortex. The funny thing to notice here is the amount of surface area taken up by the face and even the tongue, and in general all the fine motor controls like fingers and toes and so on take up the majority of the area of your primary motor and sensory cortex, whereas the major areas like the trunk and so on take up a very small percentage of the cortex. So the cerebrum has to process sensory inputs. These include taste, also called gustation. The gustatory area is taste. The visual area in the occipital lobe is vision, of course. The auditory area is hearing in the temporal lobe. And then the olfactory area is smell, processing smells. You also, in the cerebrum, you interpret language and you send messages back to form words and to speak, deciding what you want to say in a way. Language comprehension, as we mentioned, this is called Wernicke's area, whereas speech is Broca's area. And then there's just a general interpretation area. And this is showing you some of those things. Broca's area, you should know Wernicke's area as well, as is shown back here, although it's not labeled Wernicke's area, I'm not sure why. But all the other stuff is less important here in this picture. Now, we already mentioned that the gray matter is the outer layer. It's mostly cell bodies, and it makes up the cerebral cortex. Okay. And the functions of the cerebral cortex, the surface of your brain here, include speech, the ability to form speech, memory, forming memories, your logical and emotional responses, your awareness of consciousness. So humans are one of the only that we know of animals that are aware of our own consciousness, which is strange to say. Most animals, we don't believe, have that ability. Here's where we interpret other sensations, and we also control our voluntary movements. The white matter on the inside of the brain, these are fiber tracts that are myelinated. They're inside the gray matter. One example is the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres. So one example of the significance of the corpus callosum is they say that the corpus callosum is one of the main areas that defines your intelligence. And the bigger the diameter of your corpus callosum, the more intelligent you are because you improve the ability, or there's more tracts that connect the two hemispheres that can communicate back and forth. So I once heard in, I don't know, 7th grade or something, one of the students had did a presentation on different ways to make yourself smarter. And I remember one of the things they said was you can take a pen using your normal hand that you write with and cross over the midline to write your name. So for example, I would take my right hand and I would write my name on the left half of my body, but I would keep my head kind of straight forward. So the eye that dominates my vision is my left eye, which connects to my right hemisphere, and my right hand is controlled by my left hemisphere. So in order to properly do that, I'm communicating back and forth, which seems strange, but they say that's building connections. The more you use your brain, the more connections you make. Remember that nuclei are gray matter found within white matter, so the basal nuclei are also found in the cerebrum. And then on this, we will stop. And I'm out.